Hi, Maud. Thanks for coming on and talking with me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jake. I really like your show.
Thanks. I appreciate that. So I came across your work with your book Ancestor Trouble, where you're tracing your family tree and going back many generations, exploring various stories, themes, and patterns that are presenting themselves across time. And it seems like in an attempt to better understand yourself and the family that you come from. This book seemed like a massive undertaking. What led you down this road, and how did it become a book?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Um, I've always been really interested in my family, as one is. But, on my mom's side, there were these really tall tales that mostly turned out to be true. Her father was said to have married 13 times, and his father was said to have killed a man with a hay hook. And with her dad, I've so far found a mere 10 marriages to 9 women. Um, we'll see if I get to 13. And then it turned out that his dad, I discovered, did kill a man with a hay hook. But it was a very different kind of story from what I'd imagined. But,
Hmm.
I would say on my mom's side, there's this kind of joyful um, approach to telling these kinds of stories, even though they're kind of messed up and difficult.
Right.
Maybe it's a Texan thing. And then my father, he was very obsessed with family and our history. He was very proud of the plantation history of our ancestors, and he actually went so far as to defend and advocate for slavery
Hmm.
of Black people. So I think I just didn't have that ability that a lot of people have to kind of tune that out or not think about that kind of
Yeah.
history. And then, sort of like to your larger point about how did it become a book? I've been writing about my family for so long, um, my whole life, really. And as an adult, I was trying endlessly to write a novel that was kind of based around some of these themes, and it wasn't really coming together. And then I wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine that was a very small part of the book. And from there, I realized that I wanted to write this book before I tried to write fiction. And I always envisioned it as this, when my literary agent first asked me, I thought, well, I don't really want to write a book that's just about sort of the dysfunction of my family growing up. As you know from
Hmm.
taking a look at the book, it was pretty significant. Um, and I had already had a lot of therapy by then and everything. I thought, oh, that's not appealing. But, I had already started researching my ancestors and thinking in this really broad way about my family and tendencies. So it's really exciting to think about writing about my family and then taking it broader and writing
Yeah.
about, um, you know, biology and genetics, and psychology, creativity, mental health, spirituality, those kinds of things. Kind of a
So
long answer.
yeah, no, that works. I mean, yeah, I mean, by all means. When you say you've been writing about this kind of stuff for a long time, like, was this something that you were journaling about as a kid? Like, I know that you had the blog where you were writing about this stuff early on. Is this just something that you've always been doing?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, when I was a little kid, it was more just kind of writing little vignettes about my family, or like about the neighbors, the dogs getting out, or something kind of more like kid scale.
Hmm.
Um, but then definitely by the time I was a teenager or even a tween, I would say, I had this notion that I wanted to write, I wanted to write a book called, and this is so teenagery, but and you think you've got problems, was going to be the name of my book. And you know, very self-indulgent, kind of thing. But I think it speaks to sort of my awareness of, the sort of ironies of my family from a really young age, and the patterns and the ways that my parents were so ill matched, yeah, and I'm just sort of a ruminator by nature. And it was kind of my tendency to sort of ruminate about my own life, to kind of a ridiculous degree, maybe, but then also to ruminate about other people and society and, you know, um, impulses that I feel like I share with other people or don't, so that part of it, um, sort of the broader inquiries, I would say, is more college, taking classes like you are now, that I started, writing in that kind of way. And then the blog, you know, gave me an opportunity to just kind of write whatever I wanted in whatever way I wanted. So I'd say that's where it really kind of became this, um, really complex inquiry, it's multi-stranded kind of thing.
What made you want to go public with these kinds of ideas in the blog?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it just relates to the impulses that I share with my mom in
Yeah.
particular. My mom is such a gifted storyteller. I'm not saying that I am, but she is. And she's so committed to truth telling, in the way that she sees the truth, at least. She and I might differ quite a bit on what that is. And I think one thing that I've carried forward intuitively from my very religious upbringing is the idea that the truth will set you free, and that holding on to dysfunction or feeling a loyalty um, to another person that necessitates silence around harms that person did, whether to you or to someone else, is not only sort of toxic for you, or in my case me, but just toxic for them, toxic for everyone,
Yeah.
So I think, um, I tend toward radical honesty. It's just kind of an impulse in me, and definitely one that my Mississippi Delta family does not share.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's something where you felt like family bonds were kind of being valued over being honest about things that were happening. So things were kind of just being swept under the rug, and you felt like there were things that weren't being talked about that should be addressed.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, on my dad's side, my dad's mother was, very a real Southern belle. And I think she would be happy to know that I referred to her that way. But she was really the kind of person who would shut down difficult conversations by saying things like, "Look at those magnolias."
Yeah.
I mean, really, like, in this with this aggressive cheer, that would just kind of, and I would try to kind of persist and say, "Oh, but Grandma, I really wanted to ask Grandpa about this thing," and she would just
Yeah.
continue with the magnolias so forcefully that no other conversation was possible somehow.
Yeah.
So that was more the impulse on that side, and my father, is a very complex person, and definitely has his own sort of spin on the truth, which is sometimes adjacent to the truth and sometimes not.
There's so much going on in the book. Where do you start to start like collecting this information and piece these things together? I feel like I wouldn't even know where to begin. Like there's just so much that you're digging into.
Yeah, well, so with my mom's side, she and I had had conversations when I was young about some of these characters. She and my grandmother had both referred to my grandfather's dad as a Texan communist, for example. And so eventually I discovered that he was a card carrying socialist. I don't know if he considered himself a communist or not. But, it's just, I was already pretty old when I started working on it as a book. I was in my early 40s. And I had just sort of begun researching in a lot of directions through a tree online. And I had had a lot of conversations with families, sometimes really painful conversations, about difficult histories, and sometimes just more factual ones. And so, yeah, the family stories part of it, obviously there are even so many things that I couldn't include because every family has so many
Mm-hmm.
stories. Um, and then the sort of broader areas of inquiry, that was really complicated. I
It
knew
seemed,
from the
yeah.
beginning that I wanted all of that in there. Although I was scared about where the spiritual part would take me. We can talk about that later, I guess, but I knew I wanted it to be in there. I knew that was part of my impulse toward my own ancestors. But I didn't really know what that meant. So,
Yeah.
but with sort of like the science, the philosophy, the psychology, there were definitely times when I was, doing a lot of deep reading about DNA and, or reading, Aristotle at 3 o'clock in the morning and thinking, am I writing a book or am I just kind of having some sort of weird break with reality, So,
Yeah.
yeah, it was definitely very time consuming process.
Yeah. How how are you able to like it seems like some of these conversations and with what we were talking about earlier about people not wanting to open up about some of these things, how are you able to get some of these conversations going and have some of these stories be told? Like what was your approach like with various family members in getting this project to unfold?
Yeah, it was definitely a little challenging. There were situations sometimes where one person would tell me a little piece and somebody else would tell me a different little piece, or someone would share old photos with me, and that would be an opportunity to ask about memories. But, sort of going back to what I said earlier about my grandfather and my grandmother, my grandfather, I was asking about my self given namesake, Maudley, who was this object of fascination to me, because everyone always referred to her by her first and last name, I think. Like she was some sort of historical figure. And so I was trying to get my grandfather to talk about her. And I had started writing under that name not long before, maybe 9 months or a year before. And my grandparents didn't know that. And so my grandfather, geared up in this like Southern Delta way, and he said, well, the thing they used to say about Maud was, and then my grandmother chimed in, oh, they don't want to hear that whole story. And she said the thing about the magnolias. And then he said a little bit more. And then, the magnolias shut it down. But what he did say in that space was that she had been married, but she didn't want to be married anymore. And her husband came looking for her, and she, quote, threw pepper in his eyes until he stopped coming around. So occasionally there would be just these little flashes of something. And then, so naturally I researched eventually her marriage. I found newspaper articles about her, and I found she had written newspaper articles, which was really surprising. And yeah, and then I heard a different version of this story from a different part of my family, which was that she never knew that he had come looking for her. So yeah, it's really interesting when people don't want to share. But a lot of times with persistence, if you keep bringing it up, people will share a little bit that you haven't heard.
How did you deal with conflicting stories? Did you get much of that?
I did get some, and I did mention the conflicting story about her in the book, for example, because it seemed important. And and definitely sort of with my mom, and my grandmother, there were sort of different conflicting stories about my mom's father, the one who had all the marriages. He's my grandfather, but I never knew him because he died before I was born. So, I tried to be really transparent about that in the book. And I found it always really interesting when there was a conflicting story, to sort of wonder about how that had happened, So yeah, I always think conflicting stories are interesting.
So personality is a major theme that pops up throughout the book. From your research, how much of that is thought to be passed down, and how much of that is thought to be malleable? Whether it be, like fundamental traits, like maybe the big five or bigger traits versus or personality disorders, or just something like little smaller tendencies. What kind of ratio did it seem like to you?
That is really hard to say. I feel
Yeah.
like the deeper I went into it, the more questions I had. I think we're all really, I mean, my personal opinion is that it's a mix of both, and it probably varies person by person. Um, and as someone who doesn't want to be too deterministic, I think in a lot of cases we have the ability to nudge things a little bit in one direction or another, even if
Mhm.
we have certain tendencies. But, people, myself included, are really fascinated by epigenetics, the idea of intergenerational trauma, the idea
Yeah.
of impulses being passed down, or responses to traumatic experiences being passed down from, elder family members, and, from people we descend from biologically. And, a lot of hard scientists say that, that there's no evidence of that, they have a lot of criticisms of the various studies used around this in humans. And so while we know that transmission of epigenetic traits, not personality as far as we know, but other epigenetic traits can be passed down for, 12 generations or something with an earthworm, we don't have the ability, because of the human
Mhm.
lifespan to conduct the same kinds of experiments with humans. Um, but, I tend to think that the scientific impulse to view humans as really exceptional, um, I'm very suspicious of that. I mean, we are exceptional in good and bad ways, but the notion that we are so sort of important and superior, that we
Yeah.
exist outside of um, phenomena that we can show in plants and other animals, I'm always suspicious of that kind of thinking. And I think just sort of in a felt sense, we all know, that there are some reactions we have to things that are not about us, that they're about something in us that is coming from something beyond our own experience, and so we know that epigenetically we have the ability to sort of change our own health and the manifestation of our genes, for example, by exercise, by eating better, by meditating. And we know that conceivably, um, an egg that's inside of a mother, that's inside of a grandmother, you know, that those particles can pick up certain kinds of epigenetic characteristics. We do know those things, but this sort of longer term notion of personality being passed down, of mental traits being passed down, emotional traits being passed down, tendencies toward the big five, as you say. Um, it's all really gray, so there are obviously genes that can be associated with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, for example. But it doesn't always show up in people who have them, and it's not always consistent which diagnosis fits, from generation to generation. And so, yeah, I think it's really a both and from my perspective. Um, but I wouldn't discount the genetic aspects of it.
Yeah.
I have some people I'm really close with, young people in my life, who are adopted, and it's really, you can see sort of personality traits that are passed down through the genetic line, even though they didn't really know their parents.
So, as you're learning about this stuff and you're putting together this book, and now that you've written it, how has that changed the way that you pay attention to your own personality? Or do you find that you're more vigilant of your own tendencies? Like, are there certain things that you're weary of that you don't want to replicate that you learned about? And on the other hand, are there things that you're more proud of that you try to put a little bit more emphasis on to amplify? Like, how has it impacted your awareness of the way that you think and behave?
Yeah. Well, I kind of alluded to this before, but, you know, I had already had so many years of therapy before I started writing the book, and I already had a meditation practice before I started writing the book. So, you know, the book took it in a sort of different direction. It took it in a more explicitly spiritual direction, but I already was very attuned to things that were passed down to me from my family. And when I was younger, I was very reactive and a much more angry person, I would say. Um, and yeah, what I would say is that the process of writing the book and the process of the sort of spiritual inquiry that I ended up sort of doing as research around ancestors broadly, and then in a very intimate way around my own ancestors, those spiritual practices have helped me be less afraid of tendencies that I see in myself that I feel come from my ancestors that I don't want to replicate. Um, and they've helped me sort of really be more deliberate about how I want to show up in the world. I have a lot more clarity and I feel a lot less stuck, which is not to say that those tendencies aren't still there sometimes, but I feel much more able to, to just sort of operate in a healthier way in relationship to them.
How has that influenced your creative process? You mentioned in the book various things from mania to bipolar disorder to schizophrenia, which those can be very destructive, but they also do correlate with creativity. And you mentioned your mom and how she would often bite off big projects that may be more than she could chew, and then she'd end up tearing them down. And you had talked about how you've seen some of that in yourself to just kind of get obsessed in biting off big things. How is the information from the book uh like how have you integrated that into the way that you work creatively?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I definitely still have those tendencies. I still, I get interested in something and my mind starts wanting to write about it and it kind of grows larger. And I can feel certain things. I'm working on a novel now very slowly. But sort of with nonfiction, I can feel a lot of different ideas percolating and wanting to get bigger. And, one thing I think that writing this book sort of revealed to me is, I'm so glad that I was able to write this book and that my editor was on board with the scope of it, because as you say, it is really, it has a very broad scope. But I don't really want to write another book like that,
Yeah.
at least not anytime soon. It's sort of, I got it out of my system, and now I would like to work on smaller things. And so I think that one thing that I've landed on is just sort of bringing in people I trust sooner rather than sort of, I was working with my editor the whole time, but when I'm in the conceptual part of the novel, for example, I sent some stuff to my agent and I really trust her. She's a very trusted reader of mine. And then we together kind of came up with a smaller outline than what I had been anticipating. And in the past, I would have been very protective of that and felt very like, oh, this is my creative process and I have to do it my way. And now I realize, yes, it's my creative process, but my tendency is to let things get bigger and bigger. And if I
Yeah.
don't want to do that, it can be helpful to bring in someone to help me kind of rein it in and stay true to the project I want to do, but not feel like I have to include Aristotle, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, you talked about how you would put certain rules for yourself to limit extremes. Um, to be more careful about some of these things that you had noticed and were aware of. I definitely have some of that too, where I'll just kind of like lose my mind and getting obsessed with something. What how do you approach like knowing what things to pull back on versus what things are actually what things are actually allowing you to push the envelope to create your best work versus what things might do more harm than good?
Yeah, I do feel that for me and for some of us is a life's work. It's
Yeah.
always something um, that I'm going to struggle with, my sort of natural enthusiasm for things and my tendency to get immersed in things. But, one thing that I find, especially when I reach that stuck point, so when I was writing Ancestor Trouble, there were quite a few times when I sort of got mad at the book and feel like the book was requiring me to do certain things, or, I would just be frustrated with the process. And I was kind of fighting with myself, right? I mean, it's my book. I'm writing the book. Nobody is actually forcing me to do anything. So I would be in this state of resistance and this state of uncertainty. And then I would just think, I can do what I want. I don't like this notion that I have that it has to be done in this particular way. That's actually coming from me. So I would just sort of really sit with myself and get to the bottom of, well, I am interested in this. So what is the part that I am interested in? Forget about the sort of like boring recitation of whatever thing that I felt like I needed to include. Maybe I can write 2 sentences about that, and then I can shift my focus to, this other thing. And so for me, I think creative work is about, rather than restraining myself, and putting a lot of rules around things, it's actually about getting to know really intimately, well, what do I care about? Why am I doing this? What is at the root of this obsession or fixation or preoccupation that I have? And the the more true I would be to like those inner tender impulses, the more easily it would come out. And the more that I had this kind of censorious relationship to the work, or, sort of judging myself for, X or Y thing, that the more difficult it would become. So yeah, for me, that's a big part of it. And also recognizing that there are times to walk away, that there are times when I was really interested in something and I genuinely wanted to make it work. And for whatever reason, it didn't work, at least not right then, you know?
So more of a process of just paying attention to what's actually happening and what you actually want to do and feel like doing, rather than coming up with some kind of vision beforehand and trying to like rigidly force yourself to it, even when things have taken a turn where it's like that's not the right path anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of, the more I find myself thinking about how something will be received,
Right.
the more I'm like, okay, well, that's normal. We all care how things will be received. But we don't, well, the, that's not the point we're in right now, is a
Mm-hmm.
conversation I have to have with myself. Like, that's fine, but let's just stay focused on sort of, the impetus here. And yeah, and just really kind of letting go of judgment as
Mm-hmm.
much as possible. I mean, sometimes I will find in creative work that I'm avoiding something, that I'm afraid to say something. Um, one thing that might be of interest to you, given your focus on psychology, one thing that kind of scared me with the book is that I realized early on that I was writing a sort of stealth self-help book. And I, was very concerned about, historically, about being taken seriously on an intellectual level,
Yeah.
and so I really just kind of had to let go of that, and just be true to the weird project that I wanted to do, and sort of just recognize that I couldn't control, how it might be received, ultimately what people would think of what I was doing. And that was something I just had to sort of keep returning to that, over and over again as I
Yeah. Yeah, well, I appreciate you were willing to do that because I've read a good amount of self-help books at this point and various psych books that kind of also are self-help books at the same time, and often it can get pretty dry where you can see it feels like people are trying to fit within a certain box, but your book wasn't like that. It was much more colorful and like willing to kind of go outside of those lines where like it could have been like many books that I've read where it's kind of, and it depends on the goal that you have, but I do appreciate when people are allowed to like be a little bit more unique in their voice, and that came through from your writing, and that kind of takes us into the section on spirituality, which you had mentioned a little bit of that hesitation, and I thought it was interesting that although you had addressed many dark parts and downsides within your family that seemed like kind of sparked this whole exploration in the first place, you still wanted to go down a road of a spiritual practice to connect with your ancestors on that level. Could you first just explain what an an ancestor veneration practice would look like and kind of how you got started exploring that world?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that, you mentioned earlier the rules that I had for myself, and one of the big rules was just being very committed to agnosticism in my
Mm-hmm.
life. Because I grew up with so much extreme religion, I was really committed to not knowing and not engaging with spirituality in any very explicit way. But as I started working on the book, I had this sort of both this kind of like personal sense that ancestors might be spiritually important and this kind of intuition, I mean, based to some extent on reading, um, and growing up in Miami where people had a more direct kind of spiritual practice around ancestors, I just had this sense that ancestors were probably really spiritually important in many parts of the world. They still are, obviously, in many parts of the world now, in, Japan, for example, in China, in, many parts of Africa, many countries in Africa, many parts of South America and Central America. And in some of these places, the practices have been syncretized with Christianity or another kind of dominant religion so that they can still kind of be carried on, but within that framework. And so, I had some sense of this, but as I started researching, I don't know, it made me feel sort of sad that we really don't know. So, many of my people come from England, Scotland, Ireland, the supposed statistics from the DNA companies are always changing. But, in a lot of those places, especially England, the church came in pretty early. And so we don't really have any records or non-syncretized records to reflect what the spiritual practices of people were, what sort of the deities were, or, what kind of relationship they may or may not have had spiritually to ancestors. and so obviously there are a lot of kind of pagan, neo-pagan movements around this, and and I really respect a lot of what people believe around that, but I also, I don't know, I really have this need to sort of understand what the record shows or what can be empirically known before I kind of, um, I don't know, it was really important to me, I guess, to just have that on the page and work through all of that, um, sort of factually. And then, um, to just kind of like take this even a little further into the weeds, with modernity, what happened is that we became so fixated on the individual that we kind of, um, as we know in this country, have sort of lost sense of the collective. We've lost sense of a relationship, um, to the past in an intimate way as well. And so, um, yeah, so I don't know, the deeper I got into it, the more I sort of thought on a personal level, wow, there really is no more intimate and no more immediate connection to the past than our families. Um, and eventually I found my way to, some different practitioners who have, come up with various ways of kind of trying to help Western people, who are in the predicament of not having any sort of sense of an ancestral spiritual practice, find their way toward an approach that is non appropriating so that it's not kind of trying to step into, for example, the Yoruba tradition, or, becoming sort of a, for example, like a Santero or something. Instead, or, like, engaging in, practices, that people would say in Japan or Korea. And so they tried to sort of look to practices across the world and across time, and come up with an approach that would kind of allow people to either connect to or imagine they were connecting to, depending on your point of view, their ancestors more directly, kind of working through the harms, of their lives.
So, what did that look like for you? How did you go about um, these practices in the beginning?
Yeah, so I went to an intensive that was in the Asheville, North Carolina area. It was put together by a group called Ancestral Medicine, and they used an approach, um, advanced by their founder, Daniel Four, who has written a book called Ancestral Medicine. I haven't worked with Daniel Four, but the the process was to, um, I don't know, it was interesting because I read beforehand kind of like, one of the fundamental presumptions is, that there is a spirit realm and that we can interact with the dead, and kind of all of these things that were definitely a question mark for me.
Yeah.
Um, but I really didn't want to go into it from an anthropological perspective. I really wanted to go into it in an open hearted way. So I just thought, well, I will show up and I will see how it goes. I don't have to believe, yes, 100%, I am certain of this. I can just show up in, in a good faith way and kind of see what happens. And yeah, and so, we were asked to kind of evaluate our lineages. And again, it's this kind of, um, you kind of are in this like meditative space or something. And For me, I guess doing this work, it just has become really not very important whether this is real or whether I'm imagining it. I've just become more and more unclear on what the distinction is, between
Yeah.
spirituality and imagination.
Yeah.
And I find it increasingly kind of weird that in the West, and particularly in this country, we have this insistence on like, well, you know, religion must be empirically proven. And I'm just sort of
Right.
like, it's even if I'm just imagining these connections to my ancestors, that's fine.
Yeah.
If I find it useful, I believe that I'm connecting to energies that are unique to my lineages. But if I'm making it up, then that's also fine. Is how I've kind of um, approached this. And so, yeah, I feel. I mean, the approach is kind of too complex and long to explain, but ultimately, the idea is you sort of reach back to kind of ancient people who, in most parts of the world, the idea is the living family would carry on practices around the dead. And so then the dead family would kind of be seated in this, um, spiritually well way with those who had come before. And so the idea is that you're trying to access um, that lineage of like pure sort of good stuff that you might be able to take from these people. And, something that I struggled with is, no one is perfect. And, I'm sure these people also, did bad things in addition to good things in their lives. But the idea isn't that they were perfect in life. The idea is that they've achieved through veneration practices this significance to the family, this spiritual significance. And so when you do this, you kind of connect to that ancient lineage. And then the idea is that you have like some guide or face of that lineage that steps forward. And that is the entity that like does the hard work on the lineage to sort of clear it from the ancient dead to the most recently deceased person on the line. And it all sounds a little out there, and I guess it is, in the context of our culture, but I have found it really powerful to sort of go on the emotional journey of reckoning with these different lines in this way and sort of feeling a really sort of unimpeded positive thing coming through each of the lines. So that's not to negate the harms that my ancestors did through slavery, through colonization, through any of that. But on the contrary, I feel like I can show up better in the world um, and have more clarity around how I want to try to work against these sort of legacies of those harms because I feel, again, whether my imagination or some, true spiritual kind of journey that I've been on, yeah, I feel really able to show up in a much more authentic way and a much less reactive way. Like I'm really just kind of carrying forward at my best, not always, the positives um, of these lines, and that's a really powerful and kind of initially really disorienting thing.
Yeah, mentioning that it's disorienting is interesting. When you're doing these practices, like you mentioned a contemplative meditation practice that you were doing with your granny and then I believe your grandpa, what What did that make you feel like when you were doing that? Like how did the way that you felt change like before and after? What did it feel like you were kind of getting in touch with? What shifts did you feel?
Yeah, well, so you might be referring to sort of before I went down to North Carolina. I had an ancestor altar that I set up, and I
Mhm.
kind of put their pictures on it, which I don't do now for reasons we don't have to get into. But I yeah, I just wanted to kind of try to get in touch with the positive things that I had from each of them. And even, sort of just in the context of a mindfulness meditation, it was really interesting to kind of, um, yeah, just sort of have my grandfather, for example, be the focus, um, and to sort of contemplate him and me, which is something that I hadn't really done as much. This was my father's father, and to sort of, yeah, I don't, maybe it's kind of innate to that kind of practice where you're kind of like returning to the breath. You're not letting yourself get too pulled too far out, but your sort of intention around it is just this kind of awareness of that legacy. I found it really tender and powerful. And I really, I started thinking more about how he would sing, and I used to sing a lot when I was young. And yeah, just it is a really powerful thing, I think, to kind of sit with that sort of inquiry, irrespective of whatever formal, um, practices you might or might not do. But one thing I would say is that people who have a true spiritual practice around this would caution against um, approaching a recent ancestor too closely, especially a fraught one, because um, there it can be very triggering sometimes for people. So if anybody's listening to this, I did want to put that out there. It can get triggering really quickly, which is why um, some people recommend this approach of sort of like going to the ancient dead and working down from there to the more recent stuff that's so activated still for us.
Well, speaking of that, you talked about a forgiveness practice, and I think that there was a prompt and you had sent a text to your mom. What what was the aims of that practice, and what kind of effect does that seem to have had on your life?
Yeah, that was definitely a big part of the healing that I've experienced around these
Yeah.
different lines. So in this methodology, um, at a certain point, when you've kind of worked all the way down through the line, which can take a very long time or can, be done in a weekend for some people. You, yeah, you, um, the forgiveness practice is sort of forgiving the line for all the harms that they've done, real and imagined, um, you know, going all the way back to now, and then offering that, or asking that forgiveness from them for yourself. And it's to me a really integral part of that ability to show up um, in a better way and to feel a sort of positive connectedness with them. That sort of, I've done things that I'm ashamed of in relation to you, and I ask your forgiveness for that. Um, And I'm also extending my forgiveness to you, for things that you did that are affecting me now. That's one of the ways in which I feel like these practices can be so powerful, and that again, whether or not there's a kind of like spiritual truth to it, there's some sort of like whatever the arbiter of that is in the universe is not as interesting to me as um, the imaginative and creative possibilities that open up when
Yeah.
you can extend that kind of forgiveness.
For people who want to get involved in that kind of a practice, where would you direct them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I mean, there are more and more people working around this. And so, one thing I would say is that, for people whose families come from a tradition where ancestors are, there is still an emphasis on the relationship between the living family and the dead. I would say maybe go in that direction, you know, um, if it calls to you, because yeah, I feel like there's something powerful about doing the practices that your ancestors did or may have done, in relation to those ancestors. But, if people find themselves in the predicament of not not coming from that kind of tradition, as is the case for me and for a lot of white folks who are kind of like from generations of colonization and not being in their original homeland. I do think that the ancestral medicine approach can be helpful. Um, the the website has quite a few teachers who are trained in it, and it's most definitely not all white folks either. So, I would say that could be a good place to kind of go and look and see if any of the teachers call to you around that. And there are more and more people sort of offering stuff around this. So I think just go with your gut and
Mhm.
find, search around and find something that that feels right for you. But I would say that some people do kind of approach it in a more cavalier way. Um, some teachers, and I think for a lot of us, stuff gets very complicated quickly when we're approaching our ancestors in this way where we're very open and we're kind of like opening our psychology or our spirit, um, and it can be a lot. So I would just say, you know, bear that in mind if you're not someone who has a practice around this.
Overall, how has all of this work, this project, this understanding of your family and stories going back generations, how has this changed the way that you view your place in the world today and your role?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Um, I really view this question of what we carry without um, sort of knowing it as a really urgent one, on an individual level and on a cultural level. Um, and I think, I don't know, I mean, I work with writers now who are working on their own family stories, and that's really meaningful to me. Um, I prefer to do it, do that kind of work with people who are also kind of interested in the different sorts of inquiry that I raise in the book. So, I probably wouldn't work with someone who was interested in a sort of purely objective, purely factual, empirical approach. But I find that kind of work really meaningful. Um, and I continue to sort of try to figure out the best ways on a broader level to work around the harms that my ancestors did, that that I can still see the legacies of today so clearly. um and one thing that I just keep coming back to is, you know in my opinion, it's appropriate to, if, for example, someone is saying, well, you can't teach those histories because they might offend someone or something, that I think it's appropriate to respond to that, and to call that out. But at the same time, I think it's really easy for those of us who are, you know, who share my kind of like political orientation and social justice interests to sort of lecture people in a general way, rather than coming forward from a really open place of, well, my ancestors did enslave people, and I feel a responsibility to sit with that and be public about that. And, this is how I feel about that. That's a really different conversation than, just sort of judging a group of people and talking about cultural tendencies. And it may not have a different effect. Someone might still get angry, but it just feels like it's coming from a more vulnerable place. And I do think that if more of us were able to do that, we might be able to break down some of the barriers that we have today that feel so impossible to deal with.
Yeah, that perspective seems much more compelling to me because it's easy to like you said, just lecture about various opinions, but it seems much more conducive to open and beneficial conversations from the way that you're approaching it, talking about like your own family's history rather than it's like it's not because it's so easy to get defensive if somebody feels like they're being judged by somebody else, but you're taking a different perspective on it in terms of talking about your family's history, and it is, you didn't do it, so it is them who did it. So in that way, it's still like you're talking about somebody else, but it is different because you're not so far removed as
Yeah.
the usual conversations.
Exactly. I mean, as I say in the book, a little more than 150 years ago, my ancestors were enslaving people, and I'm 52. So,
Yeah.
it was a few of my lifetimes ago that was happening. And the older I get, the more recent it seems to me, because I understand now at this age, like, in the twinkling of an eye, you're 52
Yeah.
years old. And so, um, yeah, I mean, I am always trying to think about and search my heart and ask others about how I might be able to show up better in the world that's not just sort of like, here's my personal story, because I don't want to become kind of myopic around that. But I do feel really good when I can help other people also figure out how to step forward with their stories around other difficulties. I've worked with writers from all over the world, and there's dysfunction everywhere. And the more that we can be transparent about that, I think that the better the likelihood that we might be able to find a way forward that doesn't just create more confusion.
For people who want to explore their family history a little bit more, it seems like that like it's kind of overwhelming to figure out where to start. How would you recommend that people, um, I guess start down that path?
Yeah, well, so for people who are your age, for example, who, I mean, obviously not everybody's in touch with family members, but if you are, I would start by asking family members for every, kind of like sit down, write down the tree, if you can, record memories, or take notes, if you text with family, try to get them to share reminiscences or email or, whatever voicemail, whatever works to kind of get access to those memories because, um, you know, people have a habit of not being around forever, So
Right.
the sooner you can kind of get that information from the people who are living, the better. And then, I mean, in my case, I definitely don't recommend giving your DNA to Ancestry.com and 23andMe, but I have done both. And I would probably do it again if I hadn't. So, I sort of don't like that those companies have that information about me, but at the same time, um, they are really useful repositories of data. And, if you get kind of obsessed, as I have with different family stories, just remember that it takes years sometimes, like you'll kind of hit a wall and think, oh, I'm not going to find out anything more about this. But then a newspaper archive will be digitized or, you know, um, photos will turn up from someone else online or, you'll discover that your great aunt wrote articles for a newspaper,
Yeah.
and so I would say for family historians, just remember that it's a long process. It's not, um, I mean, I wrote that book and I don't want to write another book about this. I'm very satisfied with Ancestor Trouble, but my inquiry continues.
Yeah.
It's still um, interesting to me whether I'll find my grandfather married someone else after all or whatever. So, yeah.
So you're present on various platforms and mediums. If people want to get in touch with you and their work, where would you direct them?
Yeah, well, so I have a newsletter. It is also called Ancestor Trouble, so it's not hard to find. And then if anybody's interested in uh, working with me editorially, I have a contact form on my website. Right now, I am kind of busy with that, so I don't have any like public things open, but I'm always interested in sort of hearing from people. And I do teach classes sometimes. I occasionally I teach a class called Family History with Imagination, and it's kind of on the periphery of what we've talked about today, and it's just an afternoon class, but if you sign up for my newsletter, then you can keep an eye out if I'm offering it again.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I really appreciate your time. I would recommend people go and check out the book. It's especially like various parts that appeal to you. For me, is like I was really fascinated by the creativity and spirituality parts, but it ranges broadly, and there's you can definitely like get your taste for the thing that you're interested in. So, thank you a lot for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and keep in touch. I'd love to know more about your pursuits. And I'll continue to follow the show.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.